Daddy, why were you late today? The word stopped Jackson Hayes cold. His daughter Sophia sat on a plastic chair against the wall of Riverside Elementary's nurse's office, her small legs dangling above the floor. Her cheeks were flushed bright pink with fever. Her green eyes, his eyes, people always said, found him the instant he appeared, and the relief that washed over her small face broke something open inside him. He dropped to his knees on the cold linoleum and pulled her into his arms. She was burning with fever, but he held her anyway, breathing in the familiar smell of her strawberry shampoo, feeling her small heart racing against his chest. "I'm here," he signed into the space between them. His fingers moved with the fluency he'd learned before Sophia could even speak. "I'm always here. Daddy will always come for you, no matter what happens, no matter how late I am, no matter what's going on in the world." Sophia's hands moved quickly, signing back with that directness only children have. "You smell scared." He pulled back to look at her face. 7 years old, profoundly deaf from birth. Somehow more perceptive than most adults he'd ever met. She read faces the way other people read books. She saw what people tried to hide. She saw the things Jackson tried desperately to keep buried. "I'm not scared," he lied, signing slowly so she could see every word clearly. "I'm just worried about you getting better." "That's my job. That's what daddies do. They take care of their daughters." The school nurse, Margaret Patterson, watched from behind her cluttered desk. She'd seen this exchange dozens of times over the past 6 years since Sophia started at Riverside Elementary, and it never stopped affecting her. She saw a man in a faded maintenance uniform, clothes rumpled from a long shift, face lined with exhaustion. But she also saw how he held his daughter, gentle, fierce, like she was the most precious thing in the entire world. Margaret had worked at this school for 23 years. She'd seen hundreds of parents come through that door. But Jackson Hayes was different. There was something in him that didn't match the uniform. The way he volunteered with the Deaf Students Program. The way other staff members treated him with a kind of respect that had nothing to do with his job title. The way he moved through the world with a quiet dignity that suggested he'd once been something else entirely. There was a larger story here, a deeper history, something lost and deliberately set aside. Margaret had learned not to ask about things like that. People had their reasons for the lives they led. The hospital visit took 3 hours. Dr. Robert Chen, a pediatrician who'd been treating Sophia since she was an infant, ran blood tests and a full assessment. His office was warm and decorated with drawings from children, which always made Jackson feel slightly better about bringing his daughter to hospitals. Dr. Chen had a way of making everything seem manageable. It was a viral infection, he explained, showing Jackson the test results. Common in second graders, especially as the weather changed. With rest, fluids, and age-appropriate fever medication, Sophia should recover in 3 to 5 days, maybe a week if the fever decided to be stubborn. Jackson nodded and took notes. He always took notes. He'd learned early on that you couldn't trust your memory when you were terrified. Fear made your brain do strange things. Fear made you miss important details. But Jackson heard what the doctor didn't say. His daughter was fragile in ways other children weren't. The world was waiting for him to slip up, to miss something crucial, to fail in his fundamental responsibility to keep her safe. That was the unspoken message that ran underneath every medical interaction. You're a single parent. You're a poor single parent. You work maintenance. How are you managing this? He drove carefully back to their Southside duplex, keeping one hand on Sophia as he navigated traffic. The truck was a 15-year-old Ford F-150, faded blue paint that had once been bright, dented bumper from an accident long ago. The passenger window didn't open all the way. The heater sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. But the interior was clean, organized. The car seat was properly installed according to all safety guidelines. He'd checked it 3 times when Sophia was born, and he checked it regularly still. The city moved past them in the typical Tuesday afternoon chaos. Trucks, buses, taxis, people on their phones not paying attention to the road. Jackson had learned to drive defensively. Everything was a potential threat when you were responsible for another human's life. Sophia fell asleep before they reached their neighborhood. Her head lolled gently against her car seat, her breathing slow and peaceful. The fever medicine the hospital had given her was working, at least for now. Jackson carried her upstairs carefully and laid her gently on the couch, covering her with her favorite blanket. The soft one with the cartoon elephants that she'd refused to give up since she was 3 years old. It was getting worn now, the fabric thin in places, but Sophia wouldn't hear about replacing it. He sat beside her for a long time, a thermometer gripped in his hand. Outside, Chicago hummed past on the street below. Inside, there was only the sound of her quiet breathing and the weight of everything he carried. Every worry he'd ever had about being enough. Every fear that something would happen to her. Every guilt about the choices he'd made. 100.2 degrees. The fever was dropping. She would be okay. She would always be okay because he would make absolutely sure of it. That was his only job. The only thing that mattered anymore. Everything else was secondary. His career, his happiness, his future. All of it took a backseat to her well-being. But as he watched her sleep, his mind returned unbidden to the elevator. To her. To the way she'd looked at him when she recognized his face. 8 years. It had been 8 years since they last saw each other. 8 years of careful distance. 8 years of not thinking about the other. Though he'd failed at this thousands of times. 8 years of separate lives on opposite sides of a chasm that seemed impossible to cross. And then 90 seconds in an elevator had unraveled all of it. Her breath catching when she saw him. His hand tightening on the cart handle until his knuckles turned white. The recognition between them was instant and complete. The way she'd looked at his worn uniform, his sweat, his desperation, she'd understood something in that moment. She'd seen something he'd been trying to hide from everyone, including himself. He realized his hands were shaking. He gripped the edge of the couch to steady himself. The digital clock glowed 11:47. Somewhere 40 floors above the south side, in a building he maintained but would never be equal to, a woman he'd loved 8 years ago was probably lying awake thinking about him too. The thought was dangerous. He pushed it away. Sophia needed him present, focused, unshaken. He couldn't afford to be haunted by ghosts from a different life. Not now. Not when she was sick. Not when she was the only thing that mattered. He got up and walked to the kitchen, filled a glass with water and drank it slowly. He looked around their small apartment. The furniture was second-hand, collected from thrift stores and sidewalk giveaways. The walls were covered with Sophia's drawings, her artwork, her vision of the world, houses, trees, families holding hands, sun shining down from corner to corner of each page. This was home. This was everything. He returned to the couch and sat beside Sophia again, watching her sleep, protecting her even in unconsciousness. That was a father's job. That was what you did when you loved someone more than yourself. That same night, 40 floors above, Alexandra Ashford sat at her desk in an office that occupied an entire corner of Pinnacle Tower. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan. The distant glint of water caught the city lights and reflected back into her office like a reminder of everything outside her control. Everything in here was polished to perfection. Modern furniture, immaculate desk, everything exactly what a powerful CEO's life should look like. But she wasn't thinking about her company. She wasn't reviewing the quarterly earnings reports spread across her desk. She wasn't thinking about the board meeting scheduled for Wednesday or the investor call on Thursday. She was thinking about a man in a maintenance uniform gripping a tool cart with white knuckles. The image was burned into her mind. His face when he recognized her. The way his entire body had gone rigid. The way his eyes had searched hers like he was looking for something he wasn't sure he was allowed to want anymore. She called Derek Chen, her assistant. It was nearly midnight, but he answered on the second ring. Derek always answered. He'd learned over 6 years of working with her that her calls were never casual. They were never made lightly. "I need you to do something for me," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling. She gripped the edge of her desk to try to control it. "Of course, Ms. Ashford," Derek said. "Just calm acceptance. Never judgment. Never the kind of curiosity that makes you feel like you have to explain yourself. Pull the complete personnel file for Jackson Hayes. Building maintenance, everything, employment history, background, address, family information." "And Derek? Don't let anyone know I'm asking." There was a pause. She could almost hear him processing, filing away the significance of her tone. Derek was smart. He'd probably already figured out who Jackson Hayes was. But he was smart enough not to say anything about it. "I'll have it within the hour," he said. "Thank you," Alexandra said, and she meant it. Derek had saved her from having to explain or justify. He'd just accepted the request and moved on. Alexandra hung up and turned to the window. Lake Michigan spread out before her in shades of black and silver. The water was still, reflecting the city lights perfectly. She placed her hand against the cold glass and allowed herself to remember. The way Jackson used to sketch buildings on napkins during lunch breaks. His hands covered in blueprint ink. The way he'd look up from his sketches and smile at her like she was the most interesting thing in the world. The night he'd said, "I want to build the kind of buildings that save people's lives." The day her father told her Jackson was a liar, a manipulator, a man using her for access to the family company. She'd believed him. She'd asked Jackson point blank. He'd refused to defend himself, just said, "You already believe your father. Nothing I say will change that." And he'd been right. At that point, she already believed her father. She couldn't imagine him lying to her. He was her father. He was supposed to protect her, guide her, tell her the truth. She'd watched Jackson walk out of her life and convinced herself that his silence was proof of guilt, that his refusal to fight for her meant he'd never really loved her at all. She'd spent 8 years telling herself she didn't think about him, 8 years of working late to avoid thinking about him, 8 years of dating men nothing like him, men who were safer, who didn't challenge her, who didn't make her feel like she was supposed to be something more than what she was. 8 years of success that somehow felt like failure, and it took 90 seconds in an elevator to unravel everything. She pulled up her email and started scrolling through old messages, looking for something, anything, some trace of him from before. But of course, there was nothing. She deleted everything years ago, trying to move on, trying to convince herself that the past was past. The hours passed. She didn't sleep. By the time dawn started to break over Chicago, she was still at her desk, staring out at Lake Michigan, waiting for Derek to return with the file that would tell her what had happened to Jackson Hayes. The next morning, Derek left a folder on her desk. Inside were photographs, employment records, deeper documentation. Alexandra found herself pulling up the file with hands trembling. Jackson Hayes, hired 7 years ago as maintenance technician, perfect attendance record, advanced certifications in electrical systems and building infrastructure, annual salary $62,000. One dependent listed, Sophia Hayes, age 7. Mother's name listed as not present. She stared at that last detail for a long time. Not present, a professional way of saying abandoned, a clinical way of saying that somewhere in the world there was a woman who'd had everything Jackson could give her and had chosen to walk away. The thought made Alexandra feel sick. But what really pulled her attention was an archived file deeper in the system. A file from 8 years ago about the Meridian Design Project, the biggest project the company had undertaken that year. The project that was supposed to define a generation of architecture. The project that had somehow fallen apart in mysterious ways. Alexandra spent an entire evening in the building's archives, digging through old HR files that had been digitized but not prominently organized. What she found made her hand go to her mouth, made her heart stop beating for a moment. 8 years ago, Jackson had discovered structural inconsistencies in the design. He'd reported the issues through proper channels. He'd requested meetings to discuss solutions. He'd submitted detailed reports with recommendations. And then, one by one, those reports had been buried. Meetings cancelled with vague excuses. And Jackson had been told that if he pursued it further, he'd be fired for insubordination. Alexandra's father, Richard Sterling, had made that threat. She found the documentation. An email from Richard to the project manager, making clear that any further pushback from Jackson would result in immediate termination. Professional destruction. The young engineer had made an impossible choice. He'd chosen his conscience. He'd left the company. He'd walked away from his career. And Richard Sterling had made sure his exit from the industry was complete and devastating. Alexandra sat in the dim light of the archive room, hands shaking as she read. She remembered fragments of the story her father had told her at the time. He'd said Jackson was dishonest, that he'd tried to extort money in exchange for silence about fictional problems, that he'd become obsessed with her and threatened to sabotage the company when she rejected him. She'd believed him without asking questions. She'd been so eager to believe him that she'd never even considered that he might be lying. But now, reading the documented facts, she understood something that changed everything. She'd been manipulated. Her father had fed her a carefully constructed narrative, partial truths arranged to suggest a false conclusion, and she'd accepted it without investigation because she was desperate to believe the best of her father. Because questioning him would have meant questioning everything she'd been raised to believe about right and wrong and loyalty. The realization was crushing. But it was also transformative. For the first time in 8 years, Alexandra allowed herself to consider what her life might have looked like if she'd fought for Jackson instead of abandoning him. She considered the woman she might have become. Not the CEO shaped entirely by her father's values, but someone different, someone who asked questions, someone who investigated instead of accepting easy narratives, someone who would have fought for the person she loved instead of choosing the comfort of believing what she was told. She pulled up his personnel file again. Then she opened a search and typed, Jackson Hayes, Chicago architect. The results were sparse, an old LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 8 years, a brief mention in an archived article about the Harbor District project. No publications, no patents, no evidence of the career he was supposed to have, just nothing. The absence of a trajectory, the silence of a life deliberately stepped back from. She closed her eyes and imagined what kind of courage that took. To walk away from everything he'd built, to accept invisibility rather than compromise his principles, to rebuild himself in a completely different field, accepting lower pay and lower status, just to be the kind of man he could live with being. The magnitude of what he'd sacrificed hit her hard. She'd spent 8 years building an empire on a foundation of compromises, ethical shortcuts, and inherited dishonesty. He'd spent 8 years maintaining electrical systems and raising a daughter alone. And yet somehow she was the one who felt empty. By the time the sun rose over Chicago, she'd made a decision. She was going to understand what had happened to Jackson Hayes. She was going to see if there was any way to repair what her father had destroyed. She was going to take responsibility for her own role in destroying his life. But more than that, she was going to understand why he still mattered to her after 8 years. Why the sight of him in that elevator had made her feel more alive than she'd felt in years. Over the next week, while Jackson tended to Sophia's recovery and returned to his maintenance work, Alexandra dug deeper into the buried history. She reviewed the Meridian Design project in painstaking detail, cross-referencing his original reports with the final specifications. She downloaded archived photos of the completed building and tried to identify which elements came from Jackson's original vision. The building was beautiful. It was impressive. People came from around the world to see it. Architecture students studied it. It won awards. It was also fundamentally flawed in ways that nobody except Jackson would ever recognize. Flaws masked by redundant systems and over-engineering designed to compensate for the original design's weakness. Expensive solutions to problems that should have been solved elegantly in the first place. A building built around a lie. A building that survived despite its own foundational dishonesty. It wasn't so different from herself. She went to the board meeting on a Wednesday afternoon. Her father was there as he always was. His role had diminished over the years as she'd taken more control, but he remained chairman of the board. He sat at the head of the table, going through the agenda items with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. This was his domain. This was where he held power. During the meeting, she mentioned seeing an old acquaintance in the building, an old acquaintance from several years ago. She watched her father's face. His immediate response was casual, dismissive, a comment about maintenance contractors being mostly invisible, which was how it should be. But something in his tone activated her instincts, a shade too quick, a dismissal that was slightly too emphatic, the sound of someone hiding something. She'd learned through 4 years of being CEO to recognize when someone was hiding something. She'd learned to recognize it in her father particularly. After the meeting, she asked him to stay behind. She cleared the room of everyone else, and she told him they needed to talk. That evening, after everyone left her office, Alexandra sat at her desk in the silence of the 56th floor. The building was nearly empty. Most people had gone home hours ago. She had the space to herself. She made a decision that would change everything. She called her father into her office on a Friday afternoon. The timing was intentional. She wanted him caught off guard. She wanted him in a space where she held power. She wanted to level the playing field even slightly. Richard Sterling, early 60s, still commanding, still convinced of his own rightness, still operating under the assumption that his daughter would ultimately defer to his authority. He was surprised to find her office door locked. Her assistant instructed to hold all calls. The message was clear. This was serious. "Alexandra, what is this about?" he asked, the tone of a man who'd never had to explain himself. "The Meridian Project," she said. "Jackson Hayes. What actually happened?" She walked him through it. His original reports, the design flaws he'd identified, the email where her father made clear that continuing would result in immediate termination. The destroyed reputation. Richard's face didn't change much. "He made a threat," he said simply. "I eliminated it." "No," Alexandra said, her voice steady with the coldness she'd learned from watching him. "He didn't make a threat. He made a choice based on an impossible situation you created. And you lied to me about why he left." "I protected you," Richard said, "from a man who was trying to manipulate you." "No," Alexandra said, "you lied to me so I wouldn't question your ethics. You lied to me so I would become the kind of person who accepts lying as the price of doing business." This was the moment she stepped fully out from under her father's shadow. The moment she became CEO, not just in title, but in actual authority. She told him she'd discovered his behavior wasn't isolated. She'd found evidence of other corner cuts, other lies, other moments where he'd chosen expediency over ethics. "What do you want?" Richard asked. His voice different now. A calculation had shifted. "I want you to step back from day-to-day operations," Alexandra said. "You can remain chairman of the board, but the company runs differently now. I run it differently, transparently, with actual ethical standards." "That's not how business works," Richard said. "That's how my business works," Alexandra replied. "Starting now. And if I refuse?" Alexandra pulled out a folder. Inside were documents she'd assembled. Not just about Meridian, about other decisions, other moments of questionable judgment. Nothing constituting legal liability, but enough to damage the company's reputation if it became public, enough to force his resignation. "Then I release everything to the press," she said, "not as accusations, as facts, documented facts, with my full explanation of why I'm making these changes." Richard stood there, understanding he'd lost control of the situation. His daughter had learned ruthlessness from watching him, but she'd directed it at his undoing. He left without agreeing to anything. But they both knew that he would. He'd step back. He'd accept the limited role she was offering, because the alternative was worse. 3 days after confronting her father, Alexandra made a decision. She was going to visit Jackson's workplace. She'd pulled his address from personnel files. She'd learned his schedule. He worked evening shifts on Thursdays. Maintenance work kept the building running after hours when most people had gone home. She went to the basement at 6:15. She took the service elevator down, the same one she'd seen Jackson use occasionally. The elevator that smelled like industrial cleaner and metal. The one that stopped at every floor and carried boxes and equipment and tired workers. She found him in the electrical closet on the 30th floor working on a junction box with focused intensity. His entire world narrowed to this one technical problem. His hands moved with precision. His face was calm, concentrated. This was his world now. This was what he'd built from the ashes of his destroyed career. He looked up when she entered. And for a moment, they simply stood there in the humming silence of electrical equipment. The air between them felt charged. 8 years collapsed into a single moment. "We need to talk," she said. 40 minutes later, they were sitting in a coffee shop a few blocks from the building. It was a small place, nothing fancy. Fluorescent lights, plastic booths. The kind of place where maintenance workers and night shift employees came, where nobody asked questions. Alexandra had told him everything. The documentation, the lies, the manipulation, her discovery and realization, her role in it. She didn't make excuses, she didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply told him the truth. Finally, after 8 years. Jackson listened without interrupting. His expression remained neutral, but she could see the emotions moving beneath the surface. anger, pain, something like hope. When she finished, the silence felt profound. The coffee shop continued around them. People ordered. Conversations hummed. But in their booth, there was only silence. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked finally. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Alexandra said. "Because I owed it to you 8 years ago, and I'm paying the debt now. Because I can't move forward without acknowledging what I did." "What happens now?" Jackson asked. "I don't know," Alexandra said. There was something vulnerable in her admission, the first real moment of vulnerability she'd shown. "I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if you even want to. But I needed you to know that what happened wasn't your failure. It was my failure, and I'm trying to become someone different." Jackson looked at her for a long time. He studied her face like he was trying to determine if she was telling the truth, if this was genuine or some elaborate game. "I need to think," he said finally, "about this, about everything." "I understand," Alexandra said. They sat in silence for a while longer, not drinking their coffee, not saying anything else. Just existing in the same space for the first time in 8 years without running away. Over the next week, Jackson found himself unable to focus on normal work. His mind kept returning to the elevator, to Alexandra's face, to the question she'd asked him, "What happened to you?" The answer was complicated. What happened to him was, he made a choice. He chose integrity over career advancement. He chose to walk away from a woman who chose her father over him. He chose to start over in a field where his education was overqualified, but his presence was needed. He chose to be a father, fully and completely, to a daughter who needed him to be reliable in ways other children didn't. What happened to him was that he survived. But seeing Alexandra again had cracked something open. It forced him to ask questions he'd spent 8 years deliberately not asking. What would his life look like if she'd fought for him? What if she'd investigated her father's claims instead of accepting them at face value? What if they'd fought together, as a team, instead of splitting at the first pressure? He knew the answer was probably fantasy. But the fantasy was seductive and dangerous, and it interfered with his ability to focus on the one relationship that absolutely mattered, his daughter. He received a call from Thomas Whitmore, an old colleague from the Meridian Project. Thomas had recently been hired by Sterling Development as a VP of Infrastructure. He knew Jackson worked in the building. Thomas, who'd never quite forgiven Jackson for being the honest one, suggested getting drinks to reconnect and move on from old grudges. Jackson listened to Thomas talk about his success, his title, his salary, his corner office with a view of the city, all the things Jackson could have had if he'd just played along, if he'd just kept his mouth shut about the design flaws, if he'd just accepted that this was how business worked. Jackson carefully declined the invitation, but the conversation shook him. Thomas represented the path he didn't take, the path of accepting compromise, going along with the program, building a successful career even if it required accommodating ethical ambiguity. And sometimes, late at night, Jackson wondered if he'd made the right choice. Later that week, Jackson encountered a situation at work that forced him to confront his own values again. A junior member of his maintenance team discovered that some electrical work installed in the 23rd floor renovation didn't quite match code specifications. Nothing catastrophic, but a corner was cut somewhere, a deliberate shortcut taken by someone trying to save time or money. Jackson's immediate instinct was to report it up the chain, but his direct supervisor suggested that reporting it might create problems for everyone. Suggested Jackson could simply fix it quietly, off the books, without making a big deal about it. Nobody would ever know. The building would still be safe. Nothing would have to change. Jackson realized, with cold clarity, that he was being tested. He was being offered the choice his younger self was offered: compromise or create conflict. He reported it, he documented it. He didn't make a big deal about it, but he made sure proper procedures were followed. His supervisor accepted it with a shrug that might have been respect or judgment. Jackson didn't care which. He cared about being someone his daughter would be proud to know. That evening, as he was tucking Sophia into bed, she signed to him, "Daddy, you sad today?" He lied and told her no. She signed back, "You sad inside where I can't see, but I know." The wisdom of a 7-year-old girl with no hearing but perfect emotional perception, it broke something in him. It reminded him that his emotional state wasn't private. It affected Sophia. It shaped how she moved through the world. And right now he was moving through his life with a ghost walking beside him. That ghost's presence was affecting his daughter. He had to either make peace with the ghost or banish it completely. 3 weeks after the elevator, Alexandra made a decision. She was going to find out who Jackson Hayes had become. She was going to understand what had happened to him. And maybe, just maybe, she was going to see if there was any way to begin to repair what her father had broken. She arranged to leave work early on a Thursday. She drove to Riverside Elementary School in a city she barely knew anymore. Her life was so compartmentalized. Work, her apartment, board meetings. She rarely ventured to the south side, rarely left her bubble of wealth and power. The school was smaller than she expected. Colorful playground, children's drawings in the windows, a place of hope and possibility. She asked for Jackson Hayes at the front desk. The receptionist called down to the principal's office, where Jackson volunteered twice a week teaching deaf students about building systems. Within minutes, Jackson appeared in his maintenance uniform, with Sophia trailing behind him. He wasn't expecting to see her. Sophia wasn't expecting to see a beautiful woman in an expensive suit standing in her school hallway. "I wanted to meet Sophia," Alexandra said simply, "if that's okay." Jackson looked at his daughter. She was 7 years old, profoundly deaf from birth, and remarkably perceptive. She was looking at this woman with the evaluating gaze only children can manage. Then she signed to her father. "Is this the lady from the elevator? The one you sad about?" Jackson's face flushed. He signed back. "No. Yes. It's complicated." Alexandra looked directly at Sophia. "My name is Alexandra," she said. She spoke clearly, but also signed her name in basic ASL, a gesture that suggested some familiarity with deaf communication, though not fluency. "Your dad and I used to know each other a long time ago." Sophia signed. "Daddy said you were a ghost." "That made her sad," Sophia continued, with the direct honesty of children. "But Daddy is very strong, so he was okay." Alexandra looked at Jackson, and she could see her understanding something in that moment. She could see the weight he'd been carrying, the daughter he'd raised alone, the completeness of the life he'd built without her. "Would you like to get ice cream?" Alexandra asked Sophia. "All three of us? I know a really good place." They ended up at a small shop a few blocks from the school. It was warm inside and smelled like vanilla and sugar and possibility. Sophia ordered vanilla. Jackson ordered coffee. Alexandra ordered chocolate, and as they sat at a small table, something shifted. Sophia was the one who bridged the gap. She was too young to understand adult complexity. She simply observed that this woman was nice, and her father relaxed when she was around, and that was enough. She signed quickly, asking Alexandra questions with the fearlessness of children. "What do you do? Do you live in a big building? Why is your suit so fancy? Can you learn sign language?" Alexandra answered each question with patience and honesty. When Sophia asked if she could learn sign language, Alexandra said, "I would very much like to learn. Would you teach me?" Sophia nodded seriously as though she'd been given a great responsibility. She began teaching her how to sign basic words: ice cream, building, happy, dad, family, love. Jackson watched this interaction with a mixture of emotions he didn't have names for. He watched this powerful woman who ran a major company sit at a small table in an ice cream shop and let his 7-year-old daughter teach her how to sign. He watched her make mistakes and laugh at them. He watched her ask for corrections and try again. He watched her choose to change herself in this small, consistent way, not because she had to, but because his daughter asked her to. This was something. This was the beginning of something. When Sophia went to the bathroom, Alexandra turned to him. "I know I have no right to ask this," she said, "but I need to know. Is there any possibility of figuring out who we are now? Not who we were 8 years ago. Not reconstructing something that broke. But just seeing if there's something here in this present moment with us as we actually are?" "I don't know," Jackson said, with complete honesty. "I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if you can accept the life I've built, the choices I've made, the fact that Sophia will always come first." "I know," Alexandra said, "Sophia comes first. I understand that completely. I would expect nothing less." "And I'm still a maintenance worker," Jackson continued. "I'm not going to transform back into an engineer. This is who I am now." "I know," Alexandra said again, "and I think I respect you for it. I think I always did. I was just too young and too scared to show it." Sophia returned, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But something had shifted between the adults. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't quite reconciliation. It was the beginning of possibility. The opening of a door that had been firmly closed for 8 years. Over the next month, Jackson and Alexandra navigated the complicated terrain of rebuilding something from the ashes of its destruction. They didn't immediately begin a relationship. Instead, they began the work of understanding what they were to each other now, whether there was any solid ground to build something new on. They met for coffee. They talked. They listened. They shared stories about the past 8 years, the hardships, the joys, the moments they'd almost called the other but didn't, the nights they'd thought about what could have been. In one conversation at a coffee shop in the evening, after Sophia was asleep, Jackson arrived with a clear agenda. He needed to understand Alexandra's intentions. He needed to know if this was guilt-driven, if it was temporary, if she was going to disappear again the moment things got difficult. "I need you to understand something," he said. 8 years ago, I didn't just lose a job. I lost you. I lost my future. I lost the person I thought I was going to be. Because you couldn't find the courage to ask me what actually happened." "I know," Alexandra said quietly. "Do you?" Jackson asked. There was an edge to his voice. Real anger. Justified and held for years. "Do you understand what it feels like to have someone you love believe someone else over you without even asking your side? Do you understand what it's like to have your entire character dismissed as a lie?" "No," Alexandra admitted. "I don't think I can fully understand that. But I can understand that I was a coward, and I can understand that I hurt you, And I've spent 8 years knowing that, whether I admitted it to myself or not. This was the conversation where true vulnerability happened. Alexandra didn't make excuses. She didn't minimize her responsibility by citing her youth or her family dynamics. She simply acknowledged what she'd done and what it had cost him. Jackson told her about the years after he left Sterling Development, about job interviews where his references were poisoned, about potential employers withdrawing offers when Richard Sterling whispered a word or two, about the decision to step completely out of the architectural field, about meeting Sophia's mother, about the brief relationship that produced a beautiful daughter and then a woman who couldn't accept her daughter's deafness. He told her about the deep, profound joy of raising Sophia alone, and also the bone-deep exhaustion of being the only person responsible for keeping a small human alive and safe and loved, about the nights he'd questioned every decision, about the moments he'd wondered if he was doing it right. And then he said, "If I'd had you then, I don't know if I would have made those choices. I don't know if I would have become the person I am now. And I'm not sure I would change that, even knowing what I lost by being alone." "Are you saying you don't want me in your life?" Alexandra asked. "I'm saying I need to understand why I should want you in Sophia's life," Jackson said, "because Sophia comes first, always, and I need to know that you understand that." In another moment, Jackson visited Alexandra's apartment for the first time. It was a penthouse in a luxury building, all clean lines and expensive furniture, designed by professionals to showcase sophistication and wealth. Jackson felt out of place here in ways he hadn't expected. The sophistication he once aspired to now felt foreign to him. He'd spent 8 years in a Southside duplex with second-hand furniture and his daughter's artwork on every wall. His aesthetic had changed. His priorities had changed. His sense of what matters had been completely reconstructed. Alexandra watched him carefully as he moved through the space. She could see him evaluating it, judging it, finding it wanting in some way she didn't quite understand. She could see that this place, which had once represented everything he wanted, was now just a display case. Beautiful but empty. "I know this place isn't who you are anymore," she said finally. "I know you probably hate it." "I don't hate it," Jackson said. "I just don't understand how anyone could actually live here. It's beautiful, but it's not a home. It's a display case," and there, in that small observation, Alexandra understood something crucial. Jackson didn't want to go back. He didn't want to recreate the past. He wanted something different, something real, something that wasn't about wealth or status or the careful performance of success. In yet another conversation, Alexandra told Jackson about what she'd discovered when she investigated him. She pulled up the Harbor District building on her tablet and showed him the current structure, pointing out where his design solutions were embedded in the final architecture. "You built something real," she told him, "even though they took your name off it, even though they rewrote the narrative. You built something that's still there, still standing, still protecting people. Nobody knows it was you, but you know and I know, and I think that matters." Jackson looked at the image of the building, and he could see his own hand in it, his own intelligence, his own commitment to doing things right even when nobody was watching. There was also a scene where Sophia had to be part of the conversation. Jackson had been spending more time with Alexandra, which Sophia had noticed and was processing. She was a perceptive child. She saw things. She understood them on a level that sometimes frightened Jackson. One evening, as he was tucking her into bed, she signed, "Are you going to live with the pretty lady?" "I don't know, sweetie," Jackson signed back. "Would you want me to?" Sophia considered this seriously, her small face thoughtful. "Only if she's nice to you," she signed. "Only if she makes you less sad." This conversation, seemingly simple, contained profound wisdom. Sophia was telling him that she would accept Alexandra's presence in their life only if it genuinely improved their existence, not if it was just his attempt to recapture the past. By the end of this month, both Jackson and Alexandra had done the hard work of communicating their needs, their fears, their boundaries. They hadn't resolved everything. There were still uncertainties. But they'd established clearly that what was being built between them now was not a reconstruction of what was, but something genuinely new. 6 weeks after beginning their tentative reconnection, Alexandra faced a moment of profound choice. She'd been running Sterling Development according to her own vision, implementing ethical standards and transparency, addressing past harms wherever possible. But her father was pushing back. He'd been meeting secretly with board members, suggesting that her moral crusade was harming the bottom line. He was suggesting that her emotional involvement with an employee was compromising her judgment. He was suggesting that the board might need to consider replacing her. Alexandra could placate him. She could step back from her commitments. She could distance herself from Jackson, proving her judgment wasn't compromised. She could choose security and stability over the harder path of actually changing things. She chose differently. In a board meeting, with all the senior executives present, Alexandra made a public statement. She announced that she was implementing a new division within Sterling Development, the Affordable Housing Initiative. She explained that this division would focus on creating high-quality, beautifully designed housing for low-income families. She explained that she was partnering with non-profit organizations to identify communities where such housing was needed, and she announced that the division would be led by a structural engineer who was, 8 years ago, treated unjustly by this company. She said his name clearly, Jackson Hayes. The room went silent. Her father's face turned pale, then red. Board members exchanged glances that might be approval or might be judgment. Is this a personal matter? One of them asked carefully. It's a business matter and a personal matter, Alexandra said calmly. The two aren't mutually exclusive. Jackson Hayes is the most qualified person I can think of to lead this initiative. He understands structural integrity. He understands building systems. And more importantly, he understands integrity. This company needs that right now. This initiative needs that. She didn't mention her father's deception. She didn't mention the documents she had on file. She simply made the announcement and then calmly adjourned the meeting. What she'd done was revolutionary within the context of the company. She'd publicly aligned herself with Jackson. She'd publicly stated that she valued his contribution. And she'd done it in a way that framed it as a business decision, which made it almost impossible for her father to challenge without revealing the history he'd been hiding. Jackson learned about this announcement not from Alexandra, but from Derek Chen, who sought him out in the basement to tell him that something unexpected had just happened in the executive conference room. Jackson's first reaction was panic. He assumed Alexandra had made some terrible mistake. His second reaction was confusion when Derek explained what she'd actually announced. She hired me, Jackson asked, without asking me? She didn't hire you, Derek said. She proposed that you be considered for a leadership position. But yeah, in front of everyone, she just connected her name to yours publicly, which, given the company dynamics, is either brilliant or career suicide. Jackson went immediately to find Alexandra. He found her in her office, looking calm but visibly shaken. What did you do? He asked. I made a choice, she said. I chose you. I chose integrity. I chose to build something that actually matters, instead of just maintaining something that doesn't. You shouldn't have done that without asking me, Jackson said. And there was anger in his voice. You don't get to decide my career for me. You don't get to put me in the spotlight without my permission. You're right, Alexandra said. I'm sorry, I should have asked. But also, would you have said yes if I had asked? Jackson didn't answer immediately because the truth was complicated. He wouldn't have said yes. He would have been afraid. He would have convinced himself it was a bad idea. He would have protected himself by declining. But he also knew that what Alexandra was offering, the chance to build something meaningful, to use his skills for good, to be acknowledged for his actual value, that was something he'd been secretly wanting for 8 years. I need to know something, Jackson said. Is this about you fixing your mistakes, or is this about you actually believing in me? Both, Alexandra said. I do need to fix my mistakes, but I also actually believe in you. I believed in you 8 years ago, and I was too young and too scared to fight for it. This is me fighting for it now. This moment crystallized something. Jackson realized that Alexandra wasn't asking him to be who he was 8 years ago. She was recognizing who he is now, the person he became, the person who raised a daughter alone, the person who maintained dignity through impossible circumstances. She wasn't trying to restore him. She was trying to build with him. That night, Jackson went to Sophia and explained what Alexandra had proposed. She wants me to work on a new project, he told her in sign language. Building homes for people who need them. It's different work. It's harder work. But it's important work. I think I want to do it. Will you be happy? Sophia asked. I think I will be, Jackson said. And when he said it, he realized it was true. 3 months later, Jackson stood on a construction site on the south side of Chicago. The first project of the Sterling Development Affordable Housing Initiative was in its early phases. 3-story walk-ups designed to maximize natural light and minimize costs without sacrificing quality. Community gardens on the ground level. Daycare facilities, green space. Everything designed with intention and care, which was Jackson's signature approach. He was wearing a hard hat now instead of a maintenance uniform. He was leading a team of contractors and architects and community organizers. He was doing what he was always supposed to do, creating structures that served people. That lasted, that mattered. Alexandra visited the site regularly. She wasn't a boss checking in on her employee. She was a partner in the vision. She was working alongside Jackson, learning structural systems from him, teaching him about the business side of making affordable housing actually sustainable. They were building something together, literally and metaphorically. Sophia came to the site sometimes in the afternoons after school. She walked through the construction with her father, observing how buildings were made, understanding the complexity of structures. She signed questions to Jackson about load-bearing walls and electrical systems. And sometimes Alexandra took her hand and they walked together, and Jackson watched them and felt something shift in his chest. The recognition that his life was being built now, piece by piece, with intention and care. This period also explored the cost of what had been chosen. Jackson's relationship with his ex-girlfriend, Sophia's biological mother, had become more contentious. She'd learned that he was involved with someone else, someone powerful, someone wealthy, and she'd filed papers claiming that he was an unfit parent, that he was exposing Sophia to unstable situations. The legal battle was painful and complicated. Jackson had to sit in courtrooms and defend his parenting. He had to bring character witnesses. He had to be honest about his mistakes and his limitations, but also about his commitment. The judge reviewed 6 years of Jackson's devotion to his daughter, 6 years of never missing a school event, never choosing himself over her needs, never faltering in his commitment. The court ultimately affirmed what had been obvious to anyone paying attention. Jackson was an excellent parent. His ex-claims were motivated by jealousy rather than concern for the child's well-being. Through the legal battle, Alexandra stood beside him. She offered to hire a lawyer. She offered to testify. She offered financial support, and Jackson learned something important. Accepting help from her didn't make him weak, it made them partners. 1 year after the first building's completion, there was a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The neighborhood came out to celebrate. Jackson stood beside the building he'd designed, looking at families moving in. Children playing in the community gardens. The visible change his work had created. Alexandra stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her expression showing pride not in herself but in what they'd built together. A reporter asked him, "Mr. Hayes, do you have any regrets about your career trajectory, about the years you spent in maintenance?" Jackson considered the question carefully. "I don't regret my past," he said finally. "Those years weren't a detour. They were part of the path. They taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way. They gave me Sophia. They gave me perspective about what actually matters. I wouldn't change it even knowing what I lost." "And what about your relationship with Alexandra Ashford?" the reporter asked. Jackson looked at Alexandra. "I regret losing her the first time," he said, "but I'm grateful that we found our way back to each other. Not as who we were, but as who we've become." That evening, as the sun set over Chicago, Jackson and Alexandra sat on the porch of their house, a real home, filled with Sophia's artwork and family photos and the comfortable chaos of actual living. Sophia was inside, video calling with her grandmother. The spring air carried the smell of the city and the promise of warmer days ahead. "Do you ever regret the elevator?" Alexandra asked. "All the time," Jackson said. "I regret the 8 years we lost. I regret that I had to choose between my career and my integrity. I regret that your father was able to hurt me the way he did. But the elevator itself? No. I think that moment of collision was necessary. I think we needed to be rebuilt separately before we could be rebuilt together." "And now?" Alexandra asked. "Now I know who I am," Jackson said. "I know what matters. I know that my daughter is the best thing I ever created. I know that buildings are important, but they're not as important as family. I know that integrity matters more than success. I know that sometimes the wrong elevator takes you exactly where you're supposed to go." Alexandra leaned against Jackson, and he put his arm around her. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Inside, Sophia finished her call with her grandmother and came out to join them. She signed to both of them. "Are you happy?" Jackson looked at Alexandra. Alexandra looked back at him. And together they signed, "Yes, we're happy." Sophia nodded with the gravity of someone who understood that happiness was something people had to build, day by day, with intention and care. She climbed into the chair between them and rested her head against her father's shoulder. The three of them sat together as the sun sank below the horizon and stars appeared in the darkening sky. A man who had lost everything and found it again. A woman who had believed a lie and learned the truth. And a little girl who had brought them together simply by being herself. Behind them, city lights flickered on against the coming night, and ahead of them, stretching into the future like a road with no end, lay everything they would build together.